Chapter 2. Over the river and through the woods, to Ponyville we go, Part 1. Just as before, the forest seemed to stretch on for forever. Even after taking Pinky's advice of not following the path directly, the edge of the woods was still nowhere in sight. Though in between bouts of intense thought, Twilight did actually notice that she had crossed the same dirt path she had previously abandoned once or twice. So at the very least, Pinky had been right in that the path was just a more roundabout way to get through the forest, as it clearly just winded around like a massive snake. The shortest distance between any 2 points was a straight line after all, so the cloaked pony continued on this route. As she deduced earlier, there was no real harm in following the pink pony's directions. During the walk, she kept taking the time to check up on her draconic companion, confirming each time that Spike was still sound asleep deep in the recesses of the saddlebag. And while she was glad that he was still able to relax after what had happened, it meant that she wouldn't have a conversation partner for quite some time. A shame, too, seeing as how a very prominent question was currently racking her mind.
Everfree Forest. Everfree Forest. I know I've heard that name before.
The question had been bubbling away in the back of Twilight's mind ever since the encounter with the odd pink earth pony. Every time she repeated the name to herself, be it out loud or in her head, there was this odd sense of déjà vu. Twilight had known where she had picked the name up. It had to have been in one of the many books she had read in her past, but the problem wasn't where or how, but in which book she had read it. Despite her status as a traveler, Twilight was quite well read. A vast majority of her younger years had been spent in close proximity to any number of books on any number of subjects, and while this had led Twilight to be smarter than most in her age range, give or take, it also made rendering specific details of specific books something of a chore. After a point, all of the textbooks, magic manuals, and alchemic tomes began to blend together, making the process of remembering where exactly a specific piece of knowledge originated from a very daunting task. It didn't help that she couldn't recall in what context the Everfree had been mentioned. She only had a faint recollection of having heard the name. She had a feeling it was important, but she couldn't place a why or how. Once again, that itching thought would have to wait a bit longer to be scratched, for after about a half hour, Twilight managed to escape the forest, stepping out into direct sunlight for the first time in what felt like forever. The promised town wasn't that far off, maybe another 10-minute walk before she reached the first of the outlying buildings. The larger-than-expected village was a sight for sore eyes, especially after how today had gone so far. Even from a distance, it looked to be a place that was proud of its roots, most of the buildings retaining an older style of early equestrian architecture that had been lovingly maintained throughout many years. And while there were some structures that looked significantly newer, they still seemed to be built in the same general style to match the rest of the small city. This town clearly had an aesthetic to it, a calming aura of the simplicities of old country life. Even from where she was, brightly colored ponies could be seen either strolling along the ground or soaring through the sky on their ways to their various daily obligations. As Twilight drew closer to the town, her attention was drawn to the large sign that marked its entrance. The words, "Welcome to Ponyville," had been lovingly carved into the dark wood sign in an elegantly curved font, painted over in bright pastel colors to make it pop out to the eye.
Ponyville?
Twilight asked herself, giving the sign a tilt of her head in response to its warm welcome into the village it guarded. The name Everfree Forest had rung a bell, yet the word Ponyville gained no such reaction from her. It made sense. She had never once been in this particular part of the world. Why would she know the name of this town? But the fact that she knew, or at least thought she knew, the name of the forest just outside this town was a bit baffling. She would have been more adamant about figuring this mystery out, but an impatient growl from underneath protested. And it wasn't the growl of a draconic being, no. This was the roar of an empty belly that had clearly waited for too long to be filled. The woods in the village would still be here in the morning. She could interrogate herself for the information then, Assuming nothing else came up, that is. With a deep breath and newfound resolve, Twilight stepped into the village known as Ponyville. The hustle and bustle of civilization was something Twilight hadn't experienced since her time in Klugtown several weeks ago, and this Ponyville place was the polar opposite from that wretched hive in just about every way. Klugtown was a rickety makeshift city made from old rotted wood haphazardly built between a number of cliffs and canyons, somehow defying all laws of probability by still being around to this very day. Its citizens were monstrous, both figuratively and literally, and one had to watch themselves at every twist and turn to keep from getting robbed blind in the overly crowded narrow streets. And that was if the citizens and the local crime families liked you. Ponyville, on the contrary, seemed to be a much warmer and inviting place. The streets, for one, were designed to actually accommodate a large number of people, allowing for a significantly higher amount of personal space. The citizens also didn't stare down Twilight like she was a piece of meat to be chopped and sold, for aside from a few momentary glances, she was basically ignored. Just a normal pony walking through a normal pony village. A few brows were raised by her choice in attire, but no one seemed to care that much as to investigate. Twilight spent a bit of time just wandering around, getting a mental map of the town in her head for future reference. Knowing where the marketplace and a few other stores were was the biggest priority, and it seemed Pinkie wasn't the only kind-hearted soul in this town. There was a small number of ponies more than willing to offer her some directions after noticing her wandering around for a bit, and while she hadn't asked for help, it was appreciated all the same. It made getting to the next priority item on her to-do list all the faster, finding a place to stay for a night or two. And funnily enough, that had been even easier. The last thing Pinkie had said to her was a recommendation for a place called the Bedrock Inn. An odd name for a hotel, but certainly more creative of a name than Ponyville, in Twilight's honest opinion. An appropriate name for a village of ponies, if a bit on the nose. Though once Twilight set eyes on her possible shelter for the foreseeable future, she found that this name was also perhaps a bit too fitting. It was one of the newer buildings in the area, towering above most of the other buildings on the western edge of town at a staggering 3 stories, still stylized to match the same architectural structures of the rest of the town, but with a few notable differences to befit the obvious aesthetic. The building had been painted in entirely cold colors, such as deep faded blues and dark grays, all colors that would be found on common stones and rocks. Each of the building's 4 corners were decorated with support beams that were made of lovingly stacked cobblestone bricks, something entirely unique to this building. Next to the main entrance was a decently sized rock garden, which seemed to be going under some form of maintenance by an earth pony who comprised entirely of gray hues. This mare was clearly an employee of the hotel, based on the apron and the name tag bearing the name Marble. She was clearly engaged by her work, so Twilight didn't see much need to bother her. It was a public establishment, so she didn't need permission to enter. As she approached the large double doors that served as the entrance, she took notice of the large oak-carved sign that sat just above, this one reading Bedrock Inn, as expected.
A rock-themed hotel.
Twilight couldn't help but chortle to herself at the thought, walking through the building's threshold.
Now I've seen everything. Probably.
Silently hoping she hadn't jinxed herself out of seeing anything else as novel as this place on her journeys, she reached out with her magic and pushed the doors open. The interior of the building wasn't all that different from any other inn she had stayed at. The main foyer was home to a few stray chairs and couches for waiting, as well as a large, unoccupied receptionist desk towards the back of the room. The walls were lined with paintings of various sizes, all of which depicted a wide array of mountains and interesting rock formations. The exterior motif also extended into the inside, proven by a similar cool paint job. The only contrasting color was the dark wine red carpet that covered the entirety of the floor. Next thing Twilight was greeted to upon stepping through the threshold was the smell. Twilight was practically bombarded by the warm and unmistakable scent of some type of stew. The mingled aroma of potato, white and green onions, carrots, celery, and a number of other tantalizing ingredients all mixed together into a satisfying symphony that called out to Twilight's growing hunger. Following her eager nose, her head turned sharply to the left, revealing the entrance to what looked to be a large eating area. The sounds of various ponies talking over their meals could be heard from beyond the opening. It was clear that this establishment also served as a restaurant, and for good reason if that aroma was anything to go off of. But now was not the time for eating, and Twilight had to force herself to continue on towards the main desk. Shelter for the night came first, then she could stuff her face. Upon reaching the wooden countertop, Twilight rung a small service bell to no immediate response. Whoever worked at this desk must have been on break, a fact that only served to further delay Twilight's meal and rest. Sighing in frustration, Twilight began to do the only thing she could: observe her environment as she waited. As her eyes further scanned the room, a blotch of a much brighter color caught her eye, prompting her to focus on the only painting that didn't seem to be rock-themed. Hanging on the wall behind the counter, it was clearly a family portrait of the owners. An older mare and stallion alongside 4 young fillies. Every pony in the painting featured dull, almost rock-like colors, much like the young mare who Twilight had just seen outside the building. In fact, one of those young ponies was clearly that same mare, based on the exact dull hues. One of the fillies, however, stuck out in an almost comedically contradictory fashion, featuring 2 very familiar shades of pink, an equally recognizable poofy mane, and a smile about as bright as the sun itself. There was no mistaking it. Twilight had met this very pony earlier this day.
That explains the recommendation.
Twilight chuckled to herself.
Family business.
Welcome to the Bedrock Inn. A monotone voice suddenly began, cutting Twilight off from her appreciation of the portrait. She quickly looked to see who had addressed her, taking note that this was also one of the fillies from the painting, though obviously older. The Earthmare's light gray coat and dull purple mane were accented rather nicely by a simple, pale blue dress, decorated with only a name tag with the word Maud written on it. Where our service is far from rock bottom. She continued with a tone and expression lacking any noteworthy amount of emotion. How may I help you? Even her attempt at a joke was dry and dull. Though despite the delivery, the joke was still enough to cause Twilight a deep physical and emotional pain. She could have sworn she felt herself give ever more into entropy at that moment, hastening her departure from the mortal coil, even if ever so slightly. Even still, the cloaked pony did her best to keep her composure and pain hidden. Twilight had been raised to be many things, and a rude pony wasn't one of them. I'm guessing you're from out of town? The stone-faced pony asked after a short silence, leaning ever so slightly to take a look at Twilight's bags. Room for one, I'm guessing.
Oh, she doesn't waste any time, does she?
Twilight commented internally, lightly clearing her throat before continuing.
Yes, that'll be fine.
Awesome, Maud replied with the exact same level of enthusiasm. Quick question. Did Pinkie Pie send you? If she hadn't been in a public space, Twilight would have done an overly exaggerated and downright cartoonish double-take. There was no way this mare could have known about the meeting with Pinkie Pie earlier today unless she had somehow managed to get back here before Twilight did. And while not impossible, it was highly improbable.
Yes?
Twilight slowly responded, not quite sure what to make of the situation. Wait here, please. Maud walked off without another word, leaving Twilight to wonder the significance of what was to come. It was clear that there was something going on. A sinking feeling that something sinister was afoot suddenly struck, paranoia beginning to get the better of her and causing her thoughts to wander. Everyone she had met in this town so far had been nice, but perhaps a bit too nice? Memories of a book Twilight had read in the past suddenly came rushing back to her, telling the tale of a secluded village in the woods that welcomed all comers with open arms and wide smiles, only to roast them alive in a giant wicker pony to appease a spirit of agriculture in the hopes of a better harvest. Maybe that's why the name Everfree Forest rang a bell? Maybe the tree had somehow transferred her into the world of that fictional story? Preposterous, of course, but what if? Twilight's questions were answered all at once as Maud returned, placing what looked to be a large fruit basket on the countertop.
Welcome to Ponyville from Pinkie Pie.
Maud's expression was still as plain as ever.
Enjoy your stay. That's it?
Twilight asked herself, looking to the basket with equal parts caution and curiosity.
A fruit basket?
The dull-colored mare slowly glanced downward at the basket of fruits, as if to confirm the question.
Yes, a fruit basket,
Maud elaborated as she looked back to the hotel's newest guest.
Please don't take it too personally. She does this for everyone who passes through the town. The back room is filled with them.
The curious look was shifted back to Maud.
Really? Yep. She used to throw parties, but it got frustrating whenever someone left before she could finish planning everything out. So she switched to fruit baskets. I give them out when she isn't here.
Maud had spoken as if that was a completely normal statement. Throwing parties for complete strangers? That didn't make any sense. Who in their right mind would take the time and resources to throw a party for someone who was just passing through? The fruit basket thing was slightly more believable. Slightly being the operative word.
Sorry about the wait. Here's your room key.
Maud suddenly placed a simple tagged key on the countertop in front of Twilight.
Second floor, last room on the right. We charge 10 bits per night.
It took Twilight a moment to process all of that, alongside the sudden fruit basket, but she quickly complied and gave the stone-faced mare enough bits to cover 3 nights. After being thanked for her patronage and being reminded to take her basket, Twilight was off towards the large staircase at the back of the open space. Today had certainly been an odd one, but at least now she could finally follow in Spike's lead and relax. The door to the room was open and shut with intense speed, Twilight taking the time to click on the lights and admire the first proper room she had been in for several weeks. It was simplistically furnished, with a plain-looking bed, dresser, and nightstand. There was also a painting hanging just above the mentioned dresser, and like those found in the lobby, it was a painting of rocks. Other than that, there wasn't much else to say about the room, outside of the full-body mirror and the back door? Twilight found herself to be highly curious as to what this second door was for. Placing her fruit basket and saddlebags onto the bed, and relieved at the sudden lack of weight on her back, she approached the slightly ajar door and pushed it open. What Twilight saw within was enough to bring her to tears. A bathroom. Not much of one, in all honesty. It consisted only of a small shower tub combo, a toilet, and a sink in an admittedly cramped space, but it was a bathroom. She honestly couldn't remember the last time she had had a bathroom all to herself. And Spike. It was a wonderful, magical feeling that could not be described by mere mortal words. But Twilight's euphoria was suddenly interrupted with the click of her bag's latch, the fabric rustling about as the secret passenger within slowly crawled out with a loud yawn.
Twilight? Where are we?
The drowsy dragon slowly scanned the room as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He was clearly still half asleep, but still aware enough to know they had moved a considerable distance during his slumber.
A town. An inn, to be specific.
Twilight had explained as she strolled over to the window and peered out to the village outside. Glancing out the window revealed a number of ponies moving about, and she also took notice of the sky and how it had begun to transition from its traditional blue into a more orange shade, a familiar sign that the sun had begun to set. With a wave of her horn, the curtains of the window were drawn shut. Despite being on the second floor, Twilight wanted to maintain her and Spike's privacy. She had noticed a number of Pegasi were inhabitants of this country town, so it was better to be safe than sorry.
I ran into somebody in the woods who gave me directions.
Really? That's lucky. Spike yawned again, stretching out in a very cat-like fashion. Being curled up in a bag for the better part of the day had clearly taken a toll on his body.
Wait, what kind of town?
Twilight turned her attention to the door, taking a moment to examine the woodwork.
It's a pony village, unfortunately,
she answered as she eyed the entrance.
But we have our own bathroom, so there's...
Spike interjected loudly, burying his head down into the pillows as he did. Ponies didn't tend to react well to the young dragon just showing up, mostly because of the fact that despite his many abnormalities, he was still quite recognizable as a dragon. Most ponies didn't think very highly of the fire-breathing reptiles, mostly because of their antisocial and territorial behavior. So Spike chose to remain hidden during their stays in pony territory, mostly just to avoid the hassle of it all. He didn't mind all that much. He wasn't exactly a social butterfly with the many individuals outside of Twilight anyway. The only difference was that he couldn't just pop out of nowhere like he normally did. A minor inconvenience at best, but still an inconvenience. Twilight mostly ignored the rude sound that Spike had made with his tongue, instead choosing to focus on her current task. The door appeared sturdy enough. The material wouldn't block all sound, but it would prove enough to muffle anything of a reasonable decibel. But Twilight was a pony who enjoyed her privacy and the silence, and thankfully, Magic was very good at providing both those things. A quick flash of light from her horn, and then caused the wooden barrier to glow for a short few seconds.
There we go,
she exclaimed happily, clearly proud of her work. The spell she had just cast had two simple yet distinctive purposes. Firstly, almost no sound could get in or out. Any overly loud noises from the restaurant downstairs would never reach their ears so long as the door was closed, and nobody would be able to overhear Twilight and Spike conversing with one another. After all, Twilight had checked into a room for one. It would be a little suspicious if someone overheard her and Spike conversing with one another. And the fewer questions that were asked, the better it would be for both of them. The only sound that could get through the door at this point would be someone knocking on the other side, a tricky modification Twilight had to make after some issues they had in the past. The second function of the spell was something of an alarm system, to put it bluntly. If anyone other than her opened that door, Twilight would be alerted almost immediately. A bit of an extreme measure, admittedly, but one could never be too careful. Besides, it wasn't like she couldn't just undo the charm when she made her departure from the town, and it wasn't hurting anyone.
All right, Spike, we're totally alone now,
she explained happily, trotting to the center of the room with a grin.
You can do what you want now.
Twilight began to magically fidget with the clasp of her cloak. The thing was always easy to get on, but the clasp had a way of sticking when locked that made removing it a bit tricky. The small, oddly shaped dragon, meanwhile, drug his face out from the pillow with a slow groan. Lightly smacking his face a few times to help wake up, he surveyed the room once more to get a better look at where he'd be living for however long Twilight had paid for them to stay. His eyes caught notice of something a bit unusual, even for the two of them, and he slowly approached the oddity with a tilted head and raised brow.
What's with the fruit basket? Oh, that? It's a long story.
Twilight turned back towards the bed, still fidgeting with the harness on her concealing robe.
Don't eat any of it until I check it out. I want to make sure it's safe first.
Spike's deadpan stare spoke volumes about what he was thinking, yet he chose to speak up regardless.
It's a fruit basket. What could be unsafe about a fruit basket? Who just gives random ponies fruit baskets for walking into town?
Twilight retorted with a grunt, having started to use her forearms in combination with her magic to try and get this cape off. It was being particularly stubborn today.
A little suspicious, don't you think? If you say so.
The dragon chuckled as he stretched out across the bedspread. It was far more comfortable than the little nests he would make with his bedroll out in the wild, and he was taking full advantage of that fact. Click.
Finally!
Twilight almost squealed with joy as the latch came undone, the cloak being tossed across the room in her excitement to finally get the thing off of her back for a little while, finally letting her stretch out a bit more. As she stretched out her tired joints, a glint of something shiny and silver caught her eye. Confused, she turned towards the source and took notice of the room's mirror. It felt like a long time since Twilight had reflected on herself, literally in this instance, and she found herself practically entranced by her own reflection. Staring back at her from the other side of the glass was the same lavender pony she had known her whole life, the familiar mare's two dark purple eyes staring right back at her. The darker shade of violet that made up her mane, and tail by extension, was accented by a streak of a slightly different shade, which itself sat right next to a bright streak of magenta. Looking past her head and down to the rest of herself, she caught sight of the source of that silver glint. A set of radiant, silver-colored, lightweight armor decorated her frame, separated from her body by an undersuit of thick dark fabric that reached down to cover her hooves, which were also protected by a silver-hued plate. The armor was highlighted and reinforced with darker and sturdier material. The flanks of the set were decorated with a bright magenta insignia of a six-pointed star, the symbol that had come to represent Twilight herself ever since the day she had been branded by destiny. It had been quite some time since Twilight had actually looked upon the custom-made suit with her own eyes, yet she instantly remembered when and where she had picked it up. A gift from her older brother just before she departed on her journey, a loving over-precaution from a protective and paranoid sibling. The words he spoke about the armor as she gave it to her rang in Twilight's mind, specifically his explanations of the spells he had infused into the protective garb. Virtually indestructible, extremely lightweight, self-cleaning, and able to be magically removed or donned instantly with a simplified teleportation spell. It was the perfect gift for someone about to go on a long journey, and Twilight had been very gracious when she had received it. Thanks to the ease in which it could be removed and equipped, the armor was only either on her person or in her saddlebags, with no physical transition in between. And since she spent most of her time underneath that cloak, there was very little reason for her to ever notice its lovingly crafted metalwork. Over time, it had simply become a habit to take it on and off when she needed to. The sight of her armor was always enough to bring Twilight's mind back home. Mostly memories of studying, but those she had of her family was still strong. A powerful sense of nostalgia came over her as she gently ran an armored hoof against the chest piece, bringing a soft smile to her face. She found herself wondering how things were back home, and honestly considering the idea of backtracking a bit to see her family. But as her curious gaze continued along her body, Twilight was given a reminder of why she even wore the cloak in the first place, and the smile vanished in response. A set of wings adorned with lavender feathers, much like those found on a Pegasus. Her brow furrowed, and her lips pursed as she unfolded the feathered appendages for closer inspection. They had certainly been the victims of neglect for quite some time now, evident by several misaligned feathers. Despite being a winged creature, Twilight had never quite been able to figure out how to properly care for them. She'd been able to get close enough for her needs, but she was far from a master, and it showed. These wings would have certainly been helpful in a number of situations in the past, but you could never know who was watching at any given time, and seeing an alicorn just flying around was bound to raise a number of unwanted questions, prompting Twilight into her current habit of hiding her true nature in public. They were much easier to hide than a horn, and much less useful, in her honest opinion.
Maybe I'll finally learn how to properly preen these things. I'm sure there's a book on the subject in town.
With that thought, Twilight once more freed the flicker of magic from her horn, and in a blink of light, her protective attire was gone, the only other sign of its existence coming in the form of a brief bout of movement from her saddlebags. she wouldn't be needing the armor in the town, and thus could allow her body to breathe a bit.
Twilight?
Spike spoke up, knocking the alicorn back into reality with a bit of a jolt.
The fruit basket?
It took Twilight a moment to register what the small dragon meant by that, chuckling through a quick apology before trotting back over to the bed, wings returning neatly to her sides. She proceeded to throw every identification spell she knew at the collection of assorted fruits, only to find that it was indeed a collection of assorted fruits. They hadn't been poisoned, there had been no hexes or curses placed upon them, and they were surprisingly rather fresh. These revelations came as an unexpected yet pleasant surprise to the magic caster, relieving the stress that had come with her wild assumptions about being made a living sacrifice to appease some false idol. Maybe the ponies of this remote village were just nice people. An odd concept, for sure, but far from impossible.